Today's tutorial is all about one simple message. Don't copy the reference. It's okay to remove things, add things, adjust things so that you can get the scene you want. I'm going to be sketching this fascinating boat, which I actually took in a picture from a holiday out on the east coast of England. We'll be using ink, watercolors, and a few little bits of magic from Pro marker pens and oil pastels along the way. The first step, as ever, is of course building up that ink sketch. So I'm using my fountain pen with some waterproof ink here, and I'm taking a fairly slow and measured approach initially. What I want to do is get those big shapes of the boat in, and already we're looking at how we can basically not copy the reference. What I'm doing is I'm going to imagine this boat is on the sand. I don't need it to be being towed, or well, in this case, sitting on a towing trailer. It's not the scene I want in my head, and it's not the scene I need to create. What I can do is take this really lovely sky, the lovely sort of distance we can see of the different layers of sand, and pop the boat that I have in the scene on the sand instead of piling all the confusion around it. As artists, we're often feeling a bit bad about ourselves if we don't perfectly represent the image, but that's not really what art is about. If you're sat outside, the sun will change, people will walk past, this boat could move, and I'd have to sketch it from my imagination. I recently did a video where I was sketching Betty, and she definitely moved. Betty, of course, being my dog. So it's not always possible to actually accurately represent the world anyway. I would say more important is making your version of the world on the page. So here my version doesn't include the ugly, pointless yellow tractor. It could, and you could definitely make that tractor interesting, but you just don't have to. That's really what I'm saying. You just do not have to. And eliminating, adding, moving objects around the scene is one of the things that we should be doing to create great art. It's not a case of you're allowed to do it, it's a case of you should be making decisions, and that is how you differentiate your art from a photo. Here, what I'm trying to do now, having built up the shapes, is intensify some of the important lines, whilst also adding a little bit of fine hatching. That hatching, of course, adds a bit of shadow and shape. It shows that the boat is on the sand, it shows that the light is coming from the right, and it shows that there's a little bit of some, sunshine today. You don't get heavy shadows without some bright light in other places. And these simple little ink marks are really all I need to do to complete the ink sketching part of my scene. And then we're ready to pop on top of that our watercolors. Now notice how I've got a really big brush today, and I'm not painting yet, am I? I'm literally wetting the entire page except for the boat, because what I want is to create a really lovely underpainting, and then to have the boat sitting proud in front of that as a nice bit of negative space. Again, by creating an underpainting, we're editing the world, we're editing the scene to suit sort of what we imagine from it. But again, a really lovely technique, a really lovely way to show off our media and to create great art. Don't need to perfectly represent these clouds, but as we move towards the darkest shade of the clouds, we can represent them in a different way, represent them in the best way that I know using watercolors. So here I've got a ultramarine blue on the right, and on the left some indigo. Little splashes of colour into that wet painting, giving us that wet on wet, soft edged, bleeding look of watercolors, allows the sky to slowly develop. Another touch here is you'll notice I'm using the same ultramarine blue in the boat, where the boat is clearly a different colour, more of a sort of deep royal blue or something along those lines. However, as part of our artistic process, we're not copying the reference. We are recognising that art normally looks better if we choose a more minimalistic palette, so we can marry up certain colours. And in this instance, I chose to marry up the blue in the sky with the blue on the boat. It just makes a bit of sense, and it makes better art. So again, when you are approaching your color stage, do not feel your colors have to be beautifully accurate. Do not feel they can't be loose, and do not feel that when you're painting you have to be color matching what's in your scene. Instead, maybe you want to color match in one place, but then when you've color matched that object or that area, you should be thinking about what the art needs. And the art normally needs unity of color, not 400 different perfectly photorealistic shades. Normally what we want is to match some of our colors in our scene and create a coordinated color scheme. And this is kind of what I'm doing still here. I've got my ultramarine blue, I've got my indigo, I'm adding a little bit of lavender. So we've got 3 blue cool tones in there. And then I've used a lot of quinacridone sienna, which is opposing them. So the quinacridone sienna is a complementary color to blue. It will neutralize, which is how we're getting these gray shadows. And this color scheme where I'm using analogous colors, lots of different blues, against 1 or maybe 2 complementary colors is one of my absolute favorites to use. Adds a lot of drama whilst also feeling sort of pristine or calm in places as well. It lets you get a big range of emotions, and it just feels right, at least for me. And I think a big part of that is personal choice, personal preference, and how your style develops. Because we're painting wet on wet, and today I'm using 100% cotton paper, it lets me keep making little touches for a while. It lets me keep making those touches because the paper stays wet. The colours therefore blend in instead of creating hard edges. And we can just keep gently touching our underpainting little by little until we're happy that we have the kind of feel that we're after. It's still important not to go too far. Even in wet and wet, you can of course add too much pigment on the page, especially if you're not minimizing your palette. You might end up with just too many pigments and a lot of muddy feel from that. Or if you're using heavily granulating pigments or other pigments with special properties, for example, opaque or semi-opaque pigments, you'll also swiftly find, if you keep going for too long, that your image loses that lovely transparent watercolor feel. So soon enough, what I need to do is just let this underpainting dry, and then we can come back with the next layer of colors, because of course watercolors really work best in layers. They're designed to be painted in 1, 2, 3, 4 different layers, gradually building up that saturation and building up that interest. And here we are, we can see back now with our colors dry, and immediately they look a little more pale, as they should. And this is our opportunity to come in with something a little bolder and more interesting. With the sky now dry, I can actually start by touching in some reds. Again, I'm going to choose to, instead of using a different orange for the roof and a different red for the back and a different reddy sort of umbery feel for some of the shadows under the boat itself, I'm going to choose to join them all together and just use that one red. This is another choice I'm making, another way I'm differentiating my art from the actual reference. Equally, by then coming back in and putting these big brush strokes underneath, I'm just trying to create some texture and trying to create some depth as well by having big brush marks in the foreground and having them in a warmer color. That will bring everything in the foreground forward, manipulating the scene through manipulating color, through color choices again. Now it's time to bring out a smaller brush and make a few more specific touches. Again, working on just putting another layer of color on top of our initial underpainting. All I'm really trying to develop here are the shadows a little bit more and a couple of little textures, some of these splatters and things, just adding something slightly more interesting. And this is where we can start adding a bit of magic as well. Having let the page dry, I'm going to come in with some alcohol ink markers. These are actually own brand by Casa, so they're very cheap markers. But just by using a couple of greys, I'm able to add feel of shadows, which is very similar to that of watercolors, but with a little bit more control. Still lovely and transparent, but a little bit more control. I can also just enrich some of these reds, this time coming in with what is a pro marker, and this one's called Cherry. And you can see this melds really nicely with those watercolors. In just a few places, we can really make the colors pop in a way that we can't with watercolors alone. And The next, and possibly the most exciting bit of magic for today, is using some oil pastels. So you can see on the left, I've got 4 different pastels initially. These are a range of ochres through umbers and one nice, interesting kind of scarlet red as well. And I'm going to use these to layer on top of my colours. And this is where we're adding real texture. Watercolours are transparent, they work in layers. Oils and oil pastels are not transparent. They work through blending. If you put one on top of the other, you block the one behind until you blend it together, at which point those colours mix and they become a new shade. Equally, because they're opaque, they add a real sense of texture. You can see that for yourself. I don't think that's a particularly advanced thing to say. Anyone can look at this and go that with the oil pastel in there, there's a significantly larger amount of texture. By focusing that texture, these oil pastels, the opacity in the foreground, again, what I'm seeking to do is to create a sense of depth where the stuff at the front has got more texture, more boldness, and the stuff at the back has less. One thing that I felt was missing, and this was definitely a risk, but with the loose colours and how they had moved and flowed around, which is what watercolours do, I felt we'd lost a sense of the sea. We had the sky coming down, but you couldn't really tell where the sea itself was. So I thought, you know what, let's add another blue. And this time I'm using a kind of turquoise blue. You can see that with my oil pastel. And I'm blending it in. I'm trying to remove a lot of the obvious texture. It's still going to have a different texture. You can see again that the texture of it is quite flat. It's also just feels very saturated and very obvious. But I think the decision to use this texture has worked quite well. It's suddenly added a sense of the sea in the background. Just to build up the complexity and try and let it marry a little bit more with what I've done before. I'm trying another couple of blues here, which I felt matched better with the sky. And matching them to the sky gives you that feeling of the reflections coming down. And then adding a bit of white. With oil painting, acrylic painting, mixing our colours to tone them up or tone them down with white or black is a far more important thing than in watercolours. In watercolours, we tend to avoid adding white or black to our colours, and we instead just make them thicker or less thick. In that sense, because they're transparent, we're mixing the colour with the whiteness of the page by seeing how much of the page we're letting through. In oils, again, you can see here that as I add that white and blend it in, we end up with a more subtle graduated sea, less in your face, less brutal if you like. And there we go. And pretty much towards the end, the colours have all been added. And now I'm coming back in. This time I'm actually using a Posca pen. So this is an enormous amount of mixed media and hopefully used in a sensible and slightly sensitive way. But the reason I'm using a Posca pen is because a Posca pen will apply acrylic ink on top of those oils. If I tried to use a normal pen, it would just get blocked up by the oil. It would pick it up, it would block the nib, and it wouldn't do anything. So instead, I'm using a Posca pen, which will lay down acrylic ink, opaque acrylic ink, on top of the colours. So this isn't necessarily a choice of a style I'm aiming for. This is me being aware of how the media I've used already work, and therefore what I need to do to allow me to continue my normal processes. Because hopefully what you've noticed is through all of this madness of all sorts of different media, this scene has still been sketched in my normal step-by-step manner. I've added shapes with ink. I have added loose colours and slowly built them up in layers, working more and more on more refined colours and textures. And now, of course, you can hopefully see I'm refining just little details and restructuring the image with this bold ink on top, or bold acrylic paint, or bold acrylic ink, whatever you want to call it, really. And like that, the scene has pretty much come together. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'd love to hear from you what you think about editing a reference. Is it okay or is it a bit naughty? How do you feel about doing it when you do it? What's the boldest or worst, perhaps, decision you've ever made when you edited a reference and made it your own? Love to hear your stories, both positive and amusing. And I will see you in the next video.